My father took the Christmas present out of my 9-year-old daughter's hands before she had even finished smiling. He turned, placed it in my nephew's lap, and said, "This is for my real grandkid. You don't get one." For a second, nobody moved. My daughter Zoe looked at me with her mouth pressed tight, fighting so hard not to cry that her chin trembled. My sister stared at the floor. My mother froze with her wine glass halfway to her lips. And my father stood there, as if he had just corrected a seating mistake, instead of telling a child she did not belong. I did not scream. I did not ask him to apologize. I looked at the wooden town in my nephew's lap, looked at my father, and realized he had just given me the one thing I had been waiting for: proof. Before I tell you what happened after I stepped outside and made that call, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me, because what my father thought was a cruel little Christmas power play turned into something much bigger than any of us expected. And if you enjoy stories about families who finally learn that actions have consequences, subscribe to the channel and stay with me to the end. This happened on December 22nd, just a few months before I am telling you this. My parents always held their family Christmas early because my younger sister, Amanda, spent Christmas Day with her husband's family. By then, I had already been watching my own family more carefully than they realized. I had not gone to that house expecting a fight, but I had stopped assuming their smiles meant everything was fine. The gift my father took from Zoe was called Together Town. I had designed it myself. It was a modular wooden neighborhood made of small houses, shops, bridges, and community buildings that could connect even when the pieces were different shapes. Zoe had helped me test the earliest versions at my design studio. She was not the engineer behind it, but she was the reason I kept working on it, after several failed prototypes. That Christmas, I had wrapped the first fully working model and given it to her as a personal gift. When she opened the box, her whole face changed. She had seen pieces of the project before, but I had kept the finished set hidden. She lifted one of the little houses, turned it in her hands, and laughed when the connector clicked cleanly into the next building. My nephew Wyatt dropped to his knees beside her. He was 10, a good kid, and none of what happened that night was his fault. He leaned closer and said, "Grandpa said Together Town was going to be really cool." My hand stopped halfway to my coffee cup. I had never told Wyatt that name. I had never told my father, either. Amanda was standing behind the couch. The moment Wyatt said it, she reached for a plate of cookies and said too quickly, "He probably heard it from Mom." My mother, Beverly, did not answer. That was the first moment I knew something was wrong. Not suspected. Knew. My father, Kenneth Nolan, had founded Nolan Playworks more than 30 years earlier. I had worked there myself before leaving 6 years ago to start my own product design studio. I knew exactly how he looked when he saw a toy as a grandfather, and how he looked when he saw one as a businessman. That night, he was not looking at Zoe's gift like a grandfather. He was studying it. He picked up one of the pieces and tested the connector with his thumb. Then he asked Zoe to hand him the whole set. Zoe shook her head. "Mom made it for me." Dad smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Wyatt wants to see it." "He can play with me," Zoe said. I was proud of her for that. She was not rude. She was not possessive. She was offering to share while still understanding that the gift belonged to her. Dad reached down anyway. He took the base from her lap. Zoe grabbed one edge instinctively. "Grandpa, that's mine." His expression hardened. Then he pulled it free. He placed the entire prototype in Wyatt's lap and said, "This is for my real grandkid. You don't get one." The room went silent. Wyatt looked horrified. He glanced from the toy to Zoe and immediately tried to hand it back, but Dad put his palm against the box. "Keep it," he told him. Amanda whispered, "Dad." That was all she said. My mother finally lowered her wine glass. "Kenneth, maybe we should just calm down. Not give it back. Not apologize to Zoe. Just calm down." Zoe looked at me then, and something inside me went cold. Not because I was shocked that my father could be cruel. I had spent enough years around him to know what he was capable of when he believed he was entitled to something. What shocked me was how clearly everything else suddenly fit together. Amanda's strange questions about packaging sizes. My mother repeatedly asking whether I was bringing Zoe's special town to Christmas. The Nolan Playworks teaser I had seen 2 weeks earlier. advertising a new modular neighborhood product for a national retailer. Wyatt knowing the name, and now my father making sure the one fully working Togethertown prototype stayed in his house overnight. I stood. Dad looked at me like he was waiting for the explosion. He had always preferred me angry. Anger gave him something to dismiss. Instead, I held out my hand to Zoe. "Come stand with me." She got up immediately. I looked at my father. "You just took something that belongs to my daughter." He gave a short laugh. "You made it. Don't be ridiculous." "I made it for her. It's a toy, Sarah." "No, it's her toy." Mom stepped between us slightly. "Please don't ruin Christmas over this." I looked at her. "I'm not the one who did." Then I took out my phone and walked onto the front porch. The cold hit me hard enough to sting my face. I remember that because it cleared my head. 2 weeks earlier, after seeing Nolan Playworks advertise something that looked far too much like my work, I had met with an intellectual property attorney. I had brought my design files, my development records, my old employment agreement, and the public material Nolan had released. We did not have enough then. Similarity was not proof. So my attorney had prepared a notice and held it. I had told her I would not accuse my own family of taking my work unless I saw something concrete. Standing on that porch, I had something concrete. My father had possession of my working prototype. My nephew knew the product name. And Nolan Playworks had a buyer presentation scheduled for the next morning. My attorney answered. "It happened," I said. She did not ask me what I meant. We had already agreed on the threshold. "Do you want me to send it?" I looked through the front window. My father was still standing beside Wyatt. My mother was watching the door. Amanda would not look at anyone. "Yes," I said, "send it." I went back inside. Dad folded his arms. "Finished with your tantrum?" I walked straight past him. I knelt beside Wyatt and held out my hands. "Can I have Zoe's present back?" Wyatt nodded immediately. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." He gave me the prototype. Dad stepped forward. "Put that down." I stood and handed it to Zoe. "No." It was one word, but I had never seen my father look at me quite that way before. Not angry, uncertain. A few minutes later, Mom's phone vibrated. She glanced at it while lifting her wine glass. Then she stopped. I watched the color leave her face. The glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the hardwood floor. Dad grabbed his phone almost at the same moment. He opened the message. His eyes moved across the screen once. Then again. When he looked at me, his voice had dropped almost to a whisper. "What did you do?" I did not answer him right away. At that moment, I still did not know how much my parents had done, how deeply Amanda was involved, or why Nolan Playworks needed Zoe's exact prototype so badly. But I knew my father had expected to walk into work the next morning with something that did not belong to him. And for the first time in a very long time, he was going to have to explain why. The next morning, while Zoe slept later than usual, I sat at my kitchen table with coffee. I barely touched and opened a folder I had not looked through in years. My attorney had asked me to gather everything connected to my departure from Nolan Playworks, especially the final employment agreement and the intellectual property language my father's lawyers had insisted on keeping. Going back through those documents felt less like preparing for a business dispute and more like opening a sealed room in my own history. 6 years earlier, when I was 33, I had walked out of my father's company convinced I was leaving one kind of control behind. I had not understood that Kenneth Nolan considered leaving physically very different from actually becoming independent. I had joined Nolan Playworks in my 20s after finishing school and working briefly for another product company. Dad liked telling people I had come home to learn the family business, but that was never quite true. By the time I joined him, I already knew industrial design, prototyping, materials, manufacturing tolerances, and how quickly a beautiful idea could become useless if it could not survive a child dropping it on a hardwood floor. What Dad taught me was how a family company worked when one person believed every good thing inside it ultimately belonged to him. He was intelligent, decisive, and genuinely good at understanding buyers. That was part of what made him difficult to challenge. He was wrong often enough to hurt people, but right often enough to convince himself he should never be questioned. One of my first major successes there was a winter activity set that had been struggling through development for months. The original version cost too much to manufacture and broke during testing. I redesigned the locking mechanism, changed 2 materials, and simplified the number of molded parts. The revised version came in under target
dinner.
cost.
I had passed
And every time he
Walgreens
offered to
3
help,
times that month already
Rachel,
on 3
his younger
different
sister,
attempts to reach
would
my
deflect with
grandmother.
phrases like,
Every
"Don't
time the
worry,
door had
Mom's
closed,
got it."
Happens when
I
a Nolan
realized
starts
Or, "We're
then
trying to
that my
keep it
parents
small."
had not
He
panicked
chalked it
at
up
the
to wedding
diagnosis.
stress.
They
He
had
told
planned
himself
for it.
not to
Afterward,
take
They
it
had a script
personally,
ready before
but
Granny
now,
moved in.
seeing
As
it
if
in
they
They had
writing
told the
final,
hospice staff their version of me
unapologetic,
long
something
before the
inside
first
him
opioid
shifted.
was prescribed.
Ethan didn't respond.
I drove home
He didn't
that
ask
night
why.
and cried in the
He
bathtub
didn't
with the
demand an
water running so the
explanation.
neighbors wouldn't
Instead, he
hear.
stood up,
I said. I'm talking about acknowledging who solved the problem. He leaned back in his chair and smiled like I was being childish. If you need applause every time you do your job, you're going to have a hard career. That exchange mattered because I did not stay silent. I pushed for clearer documentation of design contributions after that, and I got some of it. Not everything, but enough to make my role harder to erase. I learned to save versions, keep notes, and document decisions. Years later, those habits would matter far more than a compliment in a meeting ever could. Amanda joined the company after me, but in a completely different lane. She was good at marketing. Better than I was, if I was being fair. She could walk into a buyer presentation, read the room within minutes, and change the order of a pitch without making it look improvised. She understood packaging language, retail placement, and how to make a product sound inevitable. I built things. Amanda sold the story around them. There should have been room for both of us, but Dad preferred hierarchy to balance. He started introducing Amanda as the future of Nolan Playworks, while describing me as our creative one, as if creativity were a charming personality trait instead of the reason several products existed at all. For a while, I told myself it did not matter. I was being paid well. I had influence over development. I had my own team, but the pattern kept tightening. Amanda got invited into strategy meetings before I did. Dad would ask me to fix product problems, then let her present the results. When I objected, he framed it as sibling jealousy. That was one of his favorite tactics. If I challenged a business decision involving Amanda, he made it emotional. If Amanda challenged me, he called it leadership. The final break came in 2019. I had been working on an educational building concept that was nowhere near ready for sales. Dad took an early
I have been an
prototype and showed it
ICU
to a
nurse for
regional
8
buyer without
years.
telling me.
I know
The buyer
exactly
liked
what
the idea and asked
1.5
for a delivery
milligrams per
schedule
hour
he
of
could not
morphine
realistically
does to an
meet.
82-year-old woman
When
in
I
post-op
confronted
day
Dad,
2.
he shrugged
I
and
looked at
said,
the IV pump.
"Sometimes
I
you
looked
have
at
to
Brenda.
apply pressure."
Brenda
I
looked at
told
the
him.
IV pump.
Sometimes
I
you
said
create
quietly,
failure and call it
the way you
pressure.
talk in a room with
We
a sleeping
argued for
patient.
almost an hour.
Brenda,
He accused me of
she's on a
protecting my process
1.5
more than the
milligram
company.
morphine drip.
I
You
told
can't
him he
notarize
cared more
this.
about controlling
You
the
know you
story and
can't.
building the right product.
right away.
That
My
was the day
father
I
Ethan
stopped
just sat there
suit
for a
on the
while,
steps of First
phone
Baptist
face
Greer.
down on the
outside.
table,
The Purple
letting the
Heart
silence in
lapel.
his apartment
Dad
stretch
had
as
trained
far
me
as it
in
needed
detail
to.
work that
The
included
stillness
caption
wasn't
page.
uncomfortable.
Derivative
He was
Mama
used
would
to
be
it.
so
He had
proud.
lived most of his life
She
in
let
that
it sit on
same
the
quiet
screen for 10
space
seconds.
emotionally. At
I
least
did not
even
say
when the
anything.
rooms around him were
She did
full
not
of
say
people who
anything.
shared his
I took
last
it to
name.
my
My
own
father
attorney.
That
looked at
message
the
from his
window.
dad was a
Pushed back,
ripple,
Then Annabelle
narrowed
but
played
not
her
yet a
voice
wave.
down.
and removed
Not
language
yet.
My
that
grandmother's
would have
voice
Ethan
came
had
out of the
learned
conference
early
room
that
speakers
that being
and filled the
quiet
room
was
the way it
easier
filled
than
the
being
dining.
One phrase about related development survived in the final version because, at the time, it seemed limited enough to live with. Looking at it again after Christmas, I could already see exactly how Dad's lawyers were going to try to stretch it. That was what worried me more than his anger. His claim did not have to be strong enough to win immediately. It only had to be strong enough to become expensive. I built my studio without Nolan Playworks money. I used savings, took a manageable business line to buy prototyping equipment, and spent the first 2 years doing
She did not
contract
ask
design
how I
work that
was.
was more
She
practical
said,
than glamorous.
Lily,
I was not
you
secretly
embarrassed Mom
wealthy.
in front of a
I
hospital
had a
nurse.
mortgage, payroll,
She'll never forgive
equipment
you.
payments,
Just stay
insurance,
away.
and a business loan
It's better
that
for
still had a
everyone.
balance.
I did
But the
not call
studio
my
was
sister
healthy.
again for
It paid me
26
well enough to
months.
raise Zoe
In the
comfortably.
summer of
And every machine
2024,
in that
Cassandra
space had been
texted me
bought
from a
or
coffee shop
financed
in
under my
Greer.
name or my
Lily,
company's.
Granny moved into
Every
Mom and Dad's
supplier
house last
relationship
week.
was mine.
They're saying it's just
Every
until she
file
gets
created
stronger.
there had a clean
She's
We
not
all
going
agreed
back
you're
to
not
Travelers.
welcome.
Attendance had mattered even more after Zoe became my daughter. I finalized her adoption in June of 2024, although she had been part of my life before the paperwork caught up. Dad never openly said he opposed it. Mom sent flowers. Amanda bought Zoe a bracelet. From the outside, everybody behaved correctly. The difference showed up in smaller places. Dad referred to Wyatt as my grandson. And Zoe
I
as
packed my evidence.
Sarah's
It's not
folder.
healthy. I remember
drove
135 miles. I
and
remember
stopped
Granny in the doorway
I
with a
texted
ham
Sophia
from the
house.
parking lot,
Wyatt
not
put
looking at
stock
her
to his
daughter,
name embroidered
not
across the
looking at
top.
me. Sophia,
Zoo did
walking
not.
past
I
with the
did
platter
not
to
ignore
the
his
table
ears.
as if the room had been
After
shiro
the
back.
stalking incident,
See, she
I
knew.
packed our
Vamos.
coats and
She
took
had
Zoe
known.
home
At
before
8:58,
dessert.
I walked into
In
Sterling Hall
2009,
my grandfather Henry died of complications. My sister was already at the table with our family attorney that the VA stands in 35 years. The committee was assembling on the other.
I told both of my parents clearly that Zoe was my daughter and would be treated as their granddaughter if they wanted us at family events. I was not asking them to manufacture affection. I was asking for basic respect. If they could not manage that, we would stop coming. For several months, things improved. Dad became more careful with his words. Mom made an obvious effort. Before Christmas, she called me twice to say she understood why I had been upset and promised there would be no comparisons between the children. I believed her enough to give them another chance. That was my mistake. But it was not the mistake of someone who had never set a boundary. It was the mistake of someone who thought a boundary respected for 6 months had finally become real. Sitting at my kitchen table the morning after Christmas, I looked from the old exit agreement to the folder containing my studio records. Zoe was still asleep upstairs. Togethertown was back where it belonged, safe in its box beside the living room tree. Dad had failed to keep the prototype, but I knew by then that possession had only been part of what he wanted. My phone buzzed with a message from my attorney asking whether I still had the original version history for Togethertown. I answered yes, then opened the oldest dated folder on my laptop. That was when my mind went back to June. To the afternoon, my mother had walked into my studio, stood over the earliest Togethertown presentation sheets, and smiled at me with more pride than I had heard from her in years. At the time, I had thought she was finally seeing what I had built without my father. The first version of Togethertown began with Zoe getting annoyed at a pile of toys on my studio floor. It was January of 2025, and I had brought her with me on a Saturday because I needed to finish a client revision before Monday. I kept a basket of old prototype pieces in one corner for her to play with while I worked. Most of them were parts from projects that had never gone anywhere. Plastic walls, wooden blocks, wheels, tiny doors, connectors from discontinued concepts. Zoe had spent almost an hour arranging them into what she called a city before she finally held up 2 pieces and frowned. "Why can't these houses live next to each other?" she asked. I looked over and told her they came from different systems. She pushed the pieces together anyway. "That's dumb," she said. "They're both houses." I laughed at first, but the question stayed with me. Building toys usually rewarded uniformity. Pieces connected because they were designed as one system, one scale, one set of assumptions. I started wondering whether the system itself could be designed around difference instead. Not endless compatibility with every toy ever made, but a simple connector that could let different building shapes lock together securely without forcing them into identical dimensions. The first sketches were ugly. The first physical versions were worse. One connector was so loose the buildings fell apart when Zoe moved them. Another held so tightly she needed both hands to separate 2 pieces. A third cracked after repeated twisting. Zoe treated every failure like a personal challenge. She would hand the broken piece back to me and say, "Again." By March, I had a version that worked well enough to make me pay serious attention. I changed the geometry, adjusted the tolerance, and tested different woods and inserts until the connection held under normal play but released without too much force. Zoe did not invent the mechanism. That distinction mattered to me professionally, even before any dispute existed. She was my inspiration and my most enthusiastic user tester. I was the one doing the calculations, drawings, material decisions, and manufacturing work. But she had given me the question that made the product worth solving. I called it Togethertown because the pieces did not need to match to belong in the same place. I did not tell my family the name. At that stage, I barely told anyone outside my studio. I had learned years earlier that early enthusiasm could be dangerous. People treated a half-built idea like a promise. And once enough people expected a launch, judgment got worse. I wanted the product to earn its way forward. The first fully working prototype took months. When I finally assembled the complete neighborhood on my work table, Zoe circled it like an inspector. There was a bakery, 2 houses, a narrow apartment building, a school, a bridge, and a little corner store. She moved the pieces apart, reconnected them in a different order, then lifted the whole arrangement by one section just to see what would happen. I nearly stopped her. Then I decided that if it failed in the hands of a 9-year-old, it deserved to fail before I spent money on production. It held. Zoe grinned at me. Now they all fit. That's the idea. She found a pencil on my desk, turned the base over, and wrote something underneath before I could stop her. Z plus mom. I told her prototype samples were not usually signed in pencil by children. She told me that made them boring. I reached for an eraser, then stopped when she covered the writing with both hands. Don't. I looked at her face and laughed. Fine, it stays. That little mark had no legal meaning. It did not prove inventorship or ownership. It was just Zoe claiming a place in something we had spent months testing together. Later, when lawyers and executives started talking about rights, commercial use, representations, and chain of ownership, I would sometimes think about those 3 words under the base. They were simpler than everything the adults tried to make complicated. By May, I had enough confidence in the connector mechanism to start formal protection. I had dated CAD files, iteration notes, supplier invoices, test records, and a clean trail showing the product had been developed through my studio. I filed a provisional patent application covering the connector mechanism. I understood exactly what that meant and what it did not mean. It was not an issued patent. It did not give me automatic victory over anyone who made a vaguely similar toy. It established an early filing date for what I had actually described and gave me time to decide whether the product justified a full non-provisional application. I was careful because I had spent years inside product development. I knew ideas were cheap. Documentation was what separated memory from evidence. That was also why I did not hand out technical drawings. In June, my mother came by the studio on a weekday afternoon. Beverly almost never visited me at work. She said she had been nearby after a medical appointment and wanted to see the place properly. I showed her the front office, the model shop, and the small testing area. She seemed genuinely impressed. That was what disarmed me. She stood beside Togethertown for a long time. You made all of this? Most of it. And Zoe helped? She tested it, aggressively. Mom smiled. She must love that. She does. Mom picked up one of the houses and turned it over in her hands. I noticed she was careful with it, which I appreciated. Dad had always handled prototypes like they already belonged to him. Mom usually treated my work like an extension of my personality, something artistic she did not quite understand. That afternoon, though, she asked
Then I
questions.
noticed the woman standing
How old were
2
the
feet
children I
behind
imagined
Patty.
playing with it?
Light
Would I
blue
sell it as one
scrubs.
big set or several
Name
smaller
tag Brenda
ones?
Markham.
Would stores need
RN.
much shelf space?
I didn't
Was I talking
recognize
to
her
any
from this
retailers
floor.
yet?
She
None
wasn't a
of the questions
circulating
were
nurse.
inappropriate by
She wasn't a
themselves.
charge nurse,
They
but
were
she
the
had a notary stamp in her
Anyone
hand.
curious
A
about
lot
a
of
new
South
product
Carolina
might
nurses
ask.
pick up a notary
What I
commission
noticed
for
was how specific
$50
they
of
became.
side income.
I told her I was still
Patty
working
had
through the
clearly
business side
arranged
and
it ahead
changed
of
the
time.
subject. Before
She had been
left,
waiting for the
she
morphine.
paused beside a stack of presentation sheets on my desk. They showed the visual concept, basic configurations, and a few renderings I used when discussing early direction with vendors. They did not contain the critical connector dimensions or manufacturing tolerances. These are beautiful, she said. Can I take a couple? For what? To show some friends. I'm allowed to be proud of my daughter, aren't I? The line landed harder than she probably realized. Praise from my mother had always come with a strange delay. She could admire what I did once it was finished, once it was safe, once it did not require her to challenge my father. Hearing her say she was proud of me in my own studio, over something I had built without Nolan Playworks, touched a part of me I thought I had outgrown. I still hesitated. They're presentation sheets, not technical drawings. I wouldn't know what to do with technical drawings. That's not the point. She gave me the patient smile she used whenever she wanted me to believe I was making something more serious than it was. Sarah, I'm showing them to 2 women from my book group, not taking them to a factory. I handed her 2 copies. That decision bothered me later, but I still do not think it made me careless. I had not given her dimensions, tolerances, CAD files, supplier contacts, or anything another company could simply manufacture from. I had given my mother visual presentation material because she said she wanted to show people she was proud of me. Trusting someone with limited information is not the same thing as giving them permission to use it. At the door, Mom looked back toward the work table. Do you already know which stores you want this in? I have some possibilities. National? Maybe. She nodded slowly. Then Zoe called me from the back room because one of the sample bridges had fallen off the table and the conversation ended. I watched Mom fold the presentation sheets carefully and slide them into her handbag. I remember noticing how neatly she handled them, like they mattered. At the time, I took that as respect. By early December, I had almost
60
convinced
years,
myself
your
that
sister will be
intense
dismissed from
suspense.
medical school. There was
That
the
was the
singer.
part
She
of
will
me I
never
trusted
become a
most
doctor.
in
And there was the
business
small
and
cedar
least in
box. Is
family.
that what
High
Lily
shelf
would
that
want?
she
I
did
called.
not like it.
Lily would want
based
both
on
of
the
She
need to
never
be
let me
doctored.
open
If a
that
supplier
one.
missed a tolerance,
Lily
then
would
I
want
wanted the
healing.
measurement.
You'll know what to
If
do
a
with the
client
important
changed
parts
their
when the time
I
comes.
wanted the
Family
email.
apart.
If a
By the
contract
time I was
dropped,
a
I wanted the
teenager, I had a
clause.
private
It
theory
is
that
not
my
my
mother
feelings
hated
could
this
point me
room.
toward a
Your
problem.
father
Patty
agrees with me.
preferred evidence
Christianity,
before
the
I
way
asked
we
to
some
fix
women
this.
perform
Normally,
yoga.
that kept me from
At
making
11:23,
loudly.
my father texted
my
me
family
separately in front of the
and
right
sometimes
people.
gave people more room than they deserved. Amanda was the first person to make me uneasy. She texted me one evening asking how much retail shelf space a modular building set usually needed. She phrased it casually, as if we were discussing one of the dozens of products both of us had seen over the years. I gave her a broad answer and asked why she wanted to know. She said Nolan Playworks was exploring some new concepts for the following year. A few days later, she asked what age range I thought worked best for pieces with removable connectors. Then she wanted to know whether a product like that would sell better as one large box or several expansion sets. None of those questions proved anything, but together they sounded less like curiosity and more like someone working through a retail plan. I stopped giving her useful answers. When she asked about package dimensions, I told her it depended on product architecture and buyer requirements. She sent back a laughing emoji and said I had become so corporate since leaving the family business. I let the comment sit unanswered. 6 years earlier, I might have called her and demanded to know what Dad was doing. By then, I knew better than to confront a suspicion before I understood its shape. The first public clue appeared in a trade newsletter I read every morning with my coffee. Nolan Playworks was listed among several companies scheduled to preview new products for Hearthwell stores on December 23rd. Hearthwell was a national retail chain with a large seasonal and family products business. Getting a meaningful launch there could change a year for a company Nolan's size. The article mentioned a new modular neighborhood concept, but gave no product name and no images. I read that sentence 3 times. Modular neighborhood was not a phrase unique to me. No one owned those 2 words. I knew that. Plenty of toy companies built town sets, modular systems, and construction toys. If I had gone running to a lawyer based on one sentence in a trade newsletter, I would have deserved to be ignored. Then Nolan Playworks posted the teaser. The image was mostly shadow, a row of small structures against a dark background, with a caption promising, "A new kind of neighborhood." I enlarged it on my monitor. The actual connector was hidden, but the spacing between 2 buildings and the geometry near the base made the back of my neck tighten. It looked too familiar. Not identical. Familiar. That distinction mattered. I opened my TogetherTown CAD files and compared proportions. I did not find a smoking gun. The teaser was too vague. I could not prove they had copied anything, and I could not tell whether I was seeing my own fear in a silhouette. So instead of calling my father, I called an intellectual property attorney. Her name was Evelyn Park. I had met her through another designer a year earlier and used her once to review a licensing agreement. I booked a consultation and brought more paperwork than she had asked for. My filing receipt, CAD histories, supplier invoices, testing notes, my 2019 exit agreement with Nolan Playworks, the public Hearthwell article, screenshots of Nolan's teaser, and the texts Amanda had sent me. Evelyn spent most of the meeting refusing to tell me what I wanted to hear, which was exactly why I trusted her. "The teaser is not enough," she said. "I know. The packaging questions are not enough. I know that too. And your provisional filing doesn't mean you own every modular toy that shows up after May. I definitely know that." She looked at me over the top of the exit agreement. "Good. Then we can skip the dramatic version of this conversation. What we did have was a documented development history that predated Nolan's public teaser, a filing tied to my connector mechanism, and an old employment agreement that did not obviously give Nolan rights to work created 6 years later in an independent studio. What we did not have was evidence that Nolan Playworks actually possessed my design, had used my materials, or intended to sell something derived from them. That meant the smartest move was preparation, not accusation. Evelyn drafted a rights notice that could be sent quickly if the situation changed. It stated that I disputed any Nolan claim to Togethertown or the connector mechanism, identified my development chronology, and put relevant parties on notice not to proceed as if ownership were uncontested. She also identified Harthwell's deal counsel through ordinary professional channels because the retailer presentation had been publicly reported. Nothing secret, nothing dramatic. Just information any competent attorney working in the industry could find. I told her not to send it. Not yet. She nodded. Then what changes not yet? I thought about that for a moment. If they show they actually have my working prototype, or if they represent to Harthwell that they have rights they never got from me, that's a reasonable line. We left it there. The notice sat ready in her drafts. I went back to work. That should have made me feel better. Instead, the family questions became stranger. My mother called twice in the week before our Christmas dinner. Both times she asked whether I was bringing Zoe's special town. The first time, I said probably. The second time, I asked why she cared so much. I just thought Kenneth would like to see it. He has never asked to see it. Well, he knows you've been working on something. I went quiet. Mom filled the silence too quickly. You know how he is about toys. I did know. That was why I decided not to tell her I had already spoken to a lawyer. I did not create a fake prototype. I did not plant a false document or lie about what I was bringing. I simply stopped volunteering information and paid attention to what came back toward me. If nothing happened, I was prepared to accept that I had connected unrelated dots. Then Wyatt made it harder to believe that, 3 days before Christmas, Amanda called me on video because Wyatt wanted to show Zoe a science kit he had gotten early from his other grandparents. The kids talked for a few minutes while Amanda and I stayed mostly off-screen. At one point, Zoe mentioned that I was still finishing her Christmas present. Wyatt said, "Is it the town thing?" I looked up. Zoe frowned. "What town thing?" "The one Grandpa's doing." Amanda appeared in frame so quickly I almost laughed. "Wyatt, go show Zoe the robot part." He protested that he was talking, but she redirected him and changed the subject. I said nothing. After the call, I opened the timeline I had started keeping for Evelyn and added one sentence. December 19th, Wyatt referred to Grandpa's neighborhood set before seeing Togethertown. That was not proof either, but it was one more piece that did not belong where it had landed. By the afternoon of December 22nd, I had reached an uncomfortable middle ground. I did not know enough to accuse my family of stealing my work.
Too.
But I knew enough
But
to
Granny
stop
knew the
pretending
difference.
everything
Lily,
felt
she
good.
said, on the
I
evening
wrapped
of
up
April
Town
7th,
Zoe
the night
she said it
before
the
the
way she
hearing,
said
everything
Juliet
important
called
to let
me.
my suspicions
Slow.
Her voice
That
was
away.
broken but practiced.
I
And
photographed the
blunt.
prototype before putting it in
Elizabeth,
the
she did
box,
not plead
including
herself.
the
I will
base,
lose
the
everything.
connecting
You weren't paying
surfaces,
attention. I will
and
lose
pencil
Yale.
marks
The
on
lesson
them.
moved
I will
on
lose
without
my
a
future.
future. Over the next
I am
20 years,
23
she
years
walked
old.
me
I
through
made
what
up
was
the
in the
trip
cedar
less than
box
an
on the
hour.
table.
I
said, and what will
Juliet
one
talked
day
almost
be.
like
You
a
did
whole
not
book,
make a on the high
mostly
shelf.
about
You
whether
wrote
Wyatt would like
5,000
to
There were
see
11
about a
letters
child's
my
face.
grandfather
Less than
Henry had
recent,
written her. I
answered when
unfolded
I
it.
needed
Lily,
to,
pencil,
and tried
call this
not to
woman.
turn
Child
family
holding the hand of a
Christmas
woman
into
in
an
14 days,
investigation
I had not been
before
ready. Both of them
anything
looking
had
at each
actually
other. For 14 days, I
My
had been
father
the daughter
cup
who still
holder
hoped
shaky
her mother
pencil
would
say
say
Evelyn's
something
number
true.
was already
For when
saved.
you graduate,
My mother
had
had
just
just
answered
answered
Lily,
the
question
question
age 9.
When
I
I
set
pulled
the
into my
alarm for
parents'
6 a
living room
photograph
that
of it
night,
where
I
it
told
lay.
myself
Tomorrow
the
I would
same
drive
thing I said
100
to
miles
her.
south on
I put the original
I-26 to
in
in the inner
small
office on
suspicion
Augusta
was
Road
not
in Greenville. I went
all I
downstairs.
still needed to
I would
know
meet a
was
woman my
whether
grandmother
the
had been
dining
sitting
line
across
too
from
close
Juliet
to
had
the
been
16
notified
years
by the
old.
Yale Committee on
By the time I walked back into my parents' living room that night, the room looked exactly the same and nothing felt the same. The tree lights were still blinking beside the fireplace. Someone had left a Christmas movie playing with the sound turned low. A tray of cookies sat untouched on the coffee table, but now I noticed details I had been too angry to process the first time. My father had not been surprised when Zoe opened Togethertown. He had studied the prototype like he already knew what he was looking for. Amanda had never once asked what it was called. My mother had checked the clock twice in the 10 minutes before Dad took it, and Wyatt had known the name before the wrapping paper hit the floor. I did not know what all of that meant yet. I only knew the notice Evelyn had prepared was no longer hypothetical. Mom was still staring at her phone after the email arrived. The message had gone to Dad, Nolan Playworks' general counsel, and Mom in her role as corporate secretary. Harthwell's deal counsel
Marilyn,
had copied.
we all
So my
agreed you're
sister
not
could
welcome
come.
at the wedding.
3 days
No
later,
punctuation,
the hospice
no
coordinator
explanation.
from interim
Just that
healthcare
smug
agreed
little
to call
dash
me.
she always
Polite
used in
voice
place
did
of a
not say
period.
I had won
Southern.
anything.
Ethan
Careful.
stared at the
Ms.
message,
Slater,
unsure
your
if his
parents
eyes
have
were playing
indicated
tricks on
for the
him.
patient's
He
emotional
read it again.
stability.
Then
Certain
again.
family
The
members
words
should
didn't
not
change.
visit
It
unannounced.
wasn't entirely a
I'm
shock,
so
though.
sorry.
The signs
This is
had
a
been there
family
subtle,
decision we have to
accumulating over
respect.
months.
Until the matter was
He hadn't
I
been
sat
included in the
parking
group
lot of
photo
Walgreens
planning,
with the call
hadn't
on the
received an
dashboard
invite to the
saying,
engagement.
You dragged lawyers into Christmas. I almost laughed. You brought my product into Christmas. It is not your product just because you made a prototype in your little studio. There it was. Not surprise. Not confusion. Opposition. Amanda finally looked at him. Dad, maybe we should stop talking. He ignored her. You worked for Nolan Playworks for years, he said. Everything you know about product development came from this company. That is not how ownership works. You want to lecture me about how my own industry works? No. I want you to explain why Wyatt knew the product name before tonight. Dad's face changed for half a second. Amanda answered before he could. Kids overhear things. From where? Mom talks. Mom said, Sarah, please. I looked at her. You called me twice this week to make sure I was bringing this prototype. Her grip tightened around the stem of her new wine glass. Someone had already cleaned up the shattered one. I wanted your father to see it. He saw it. You know what I mean. No, Mom, I don't. Dad cut in. This is ridiculous. You are blowing up a retailer relationship because your feelings got hurt. I felt Zoe's hand slip into mine. That ended the conversation for me. I'm taking her home. Dad's expression hardened. You always do this. You create a scene, then run away before anyone can talk sense into you. I picked up Zoe's coat. The last time
Anything
I
else in your family? I replied with one sentence. Anything physical, actually connected to Call Grandma's lawyer, and I knew who she really trusted. I just did not. The next morning, it wasn't my lawyer who called. I called. It was theirs. His voice. I had not called her in 4 months. We need to talk. Nervous, right? The way she always picked up when she did not recognize the number on the screen. They had no idea that every cruel thing they did in that hospice room. I had been watching them. I need to ask you something. My name is. Did you ever meet my mother in person? 33.
I had asked one question after we got into the car. Does Grandpa really think I'm not his granddaughter? I kept my eyes on the road. I think Grandpa said something cruel because he wanted something and didn't like being told no. That's not what I asked. She had always been better at catching evasions than most adults. I waited until I could answer without giving her a promise I could not keep. I don't know what he believes in his head. I know what I believe. You're my daughter. That part is not up for discussion. She leaned back against the seat. A few minutes later, she fell asleep. The next morning, December 23rd, Harthwell formally paused the Togethertown portion of Nolan Playworks' product review. Not the entire relationship, not every product, just the part tied to the disputed design. Their legal team asked Nolan for clarification about chain of rights before they would consider any commercial commitment. That mattered because it was reasonable. Harthwell did not care who had been mean to whom at Christmas. They cared whether a company trying to sell them a product actually had the right to sell it. At 9:14 that morning, Evelyn forwarded me a letter from Nolan Playworks counsel. Dad had not wasted time. The letter claimed Togethertown might qualify as a related development under the agreement I had signed when I left Nolan Playworks in 2019. It argued that the connector system could derive from methods and design principles I had worked with while employed there. It demanded that I stop interfering with Nolan's retailer relationship and preserve all records connected to Togethertown. I read the letter once, then again. Then I called Evelyn. They cannot seriously believe this. They may not need to, she said. They only need to believe they can make the argument expensive. That landed harder than I wanted it to. How weak is it? Weak is not the same as harmless. She reminded me that the agreement had been negotiated, that Nolan did not own everything I created for the rest of my life, and that 6 years had passed before Togethertown existed. My independent studio records helped me. So did my supplier trail and the May filing date. But the old clause gave Nolan something to point at, and Dad had lawyers on payroll. If this becomes litigation, Evelyn said, you can spend a lot of money proving something you already know. I looked through the glass wall of my office at the workshop beyond it. 2 employees were adjusting a client prototype at one of the benches. Another was on the phone with a supplier. The studio was healthy, but healthy was not the same as invulnerable. I still had an equipment line from expanding our prototyping capability. I had payroll, insurance, rent. I could fund a legal fight for a while. I could not pretend it had no cost. That was the first moment Dad's counterattack worked on me. Not because I thought he was right. Because I understood exactly what he was trying to make expensive. I spent the rest of the morning building a chronology. I pulled the earliest Togethertown sketches, CAD timestamps, supplier invoices, material orders, testing logs, emails discussing failed connector versions. The filing receipt from May. I created a clean folder for everything related to development and another for my old Nolan employment records. I did not post anything online. I did not call relatives. I did not send Dad an angry text. Evidence first, anger later, if it was still useful. By late afternoon, the lawyers on both sides had reached a temporary arrangement designed to stop the situation from getting worse over the holidays. Nolan would not present or launch Togethertown while the rights issue was unresolved. Neither side would destroy relevant records. We would exchange a limited set of documents showing the basis of each side's claim under a confidentiality agreement. Harthwell agreed to keep the product review open rather than
Through
closing the door
hospital
entirely.
security under the
No one
Internal
called it
Volunteer
peace.
Coordination
It
Audit
was more like
Policy.
everyone agreeing
She
not
had
to
been
light
at
a
Boston
match
Children's
while standing in
24
gasoline.
years.
Nolan's
They
counsel
trusted
sent
her.
their first
The
light
first
packet a
file
day
was my
after
patient
Christmas.
navigator
I
log.
opened it at home.
3,200
Built-in
total
intelligence.
hours
Most of it
of
was
Battery
exactly
saves
what I
power,
expected.
and updates are automatic.
1,180
So
of
even
those
if work
hours were
interrupts you,
specifically with Lily Donovan
Dell
and her
Pro
mother.
will.
Summary claiming
Bedside
Nolan had
reading,
years of experience with
translation,
modular building
family
concepts.
conferences,
References
hospice
to
support.
internal
We're
development
Phoenix
projects
After
Energy,
hours
I could
visits,
not
I
family-owned.
identify yet. Nothing in those first pages made me panic. Then I reached the attachment labeled Concept Reference 2. I recognized the page before it fully loaded. It was one of the presentation sheets from my studio. The layout was mine. The rendering was mine. Even the small crop mark near the corner was in the same place. I leaned closer to the screen. There was a faint brown ring near the edge of the paper, like someone had set a coffee cup on it. And beside one of the images, in dark blue ink, someone had written, "Ken's second version is stronger." I stared at those 6 words until my eyes started to ache. For weeks, I had suspected Amanda. She worked in marketing. She knew packaging. She had access to Dad. She had the most obvious professional motive. But I knew that handwriting. I had seen it on birthday cards, grocery lists, Christmas tags, and notes left on my kitchen counter since I was a child. The first person who had carried Togethertown out of my studio had not been Amanda.
Phone lit up again.
We're going to
Been
play
my
3
mother.
A
things.
message.
I did not call
Annabelle
my
said.
mother
This
that
time,
night.
it
Then
wasn't
we're
from
going to talk.
Marilyn.
Handwriting
It
looked like
wasn't
hers.
from
She started
Rachel.
clip
after
3.
It wasn't even
My
from one
mother
of the
watched
cousins,
herself.
Confused.
who
On a
likely had
wall
no
mounted
idea what
screen
had
at
just
a
happened.
stranger's conference
It was
room.
from his father,
Slide her
Thomas
own
Miller.
mother's engagement
You
ring
around?
off her own
I think you
mother's
should
finger.
see something.
The
Just
audio
that.
is perfectly
7
clear.
words.
No
No
It's okay,
drama,
Mama.
no
I'm just gonna
emotion.
look
I
at
wanted
it.
to know whether
Just a
anyone
quiet
Don't
flag
worry,
in the
on
cloud
wind,
storage
signaling
mother
that
opened
whatever
her mouth.
Ethan had assumed about the
Downloaded
boundaries of this
Togethertown
family
That's editing.
fracture.
or accessed the CAD archive from outside our normal locations. If Amanda had somehow gotten into my files, I wanted to know before I confronted anyone. The review took several days because I asked him to be thorough. When he called me back, the answer was almost disappointing in its simplicity. There had been no suspicious login, no strange download, no outside access to the CAD system, and no evidence that anyone had copied the technical files through my network. The people who had opened Togethertown documents were exactly the people who were supposed to. Me, 2 members of my team, and 1 vendor account with restricted access to a manufacturing package. Nothing pointed to Amanda sneaking into anything. I sat in my office after the call and admitted something I did not enjoy admitting. I had been wrong about the source. Amanda had motive. She had access to Dad. She knew retail language. She had asked questions that made me uncomfortable. It had been easy to build a theory around her because she fit it, but easy was not the same as true. Whatever Amanda had done later, she had not broken into my system and stolen the original material that way. That left the paper in front of me. I printed the scan from Nolan's packet, and laid it beside 3 things I already had. A birthday card Mom had sent Zoe, a handwritten note she had left in my kitchen the previous spring, and a list she had made during one of her visits to my studio. I was not pretending to be a handwriting expert. I did not need to be. The long downward stroke in her K, the open loop in her second E, the way she wrote the word version with a slightly oversized V were all familiar to me because I had been seeing them my entire life. I sent copies to Evelyn. Her response was careful. "It supports your timeline," she said. "It is not enough by itself to establish everything we need. If Beverly confirms she gave Kenneth the sheets, that matters more." "I know. Are you going to call her?" "No. I wanted to see her face." Mom agreed to meet 2 days later. I did not invite her to my studio. I did not want her anywhere near my work until I understood exactly what she had done. I went to my parents' house in the middle of the afternoon while Dad was at Nolan Playworks. Mom opened the door with the strained expression of someone who had spent the week waiting for a conversation she hoped would never happen. She tried to begin normally. She offered coffee, asked whether Zoe was sleeping better, told me she had bought a replacement ornament for the one Wyatt had broken at Christmas. I let her talk until she ran out of safe subjects. Then I placed the printed concept sheet on the kitchen table. Her eyes went straight to the handwriting. She did not ask what it was. That told me almost as much as an answer. "Mom, did you give Dad the Togethertown sheets I gave you in June?" Her first response was exactly what I expected. I showed him a couple of pictures. "That is not what I asked. I thought he would be interested. Did you give them to him?" She pressed her lips together. "Sarah, they were presentation pages. You told me yourself they weren't technical." I stared at her. "So you remember exactly what they contained?" "I remember what you said. Did you give them to Dad?" She looked away. "Yes. There are betrayals that arrive with shock, and there are betrayals that arrive with recognition. That one was the second kind. Some part of me had known the answer since I saw her handwriting. Hearing her say it did not surprise me. It simply removed the last place I could hide from it." "Why?" Mom folded her hands on the table. "Your father was worried about the company. That doesn't answer the question. Nolan had a bad year. Then another one. That product line they launched last spring did not perform the way they expected. Harthwell was interested in seeing something fresh, and Kenneth was under enormous pressure. So you gave him my work." I showed him an idea. "You handed him material from my studio without asking me. You weren't using those pages for anything confidential. That is not your decision." I knew you would say that. I leaned back slowly. "Then why didn't you ask?" Her face tightened. "Because you would have said no." That was the first completely honest thing she had said since I arrived. I let the silence sit between us. Mom started again, softer this time. "Sarah, your father built that company from nothing. There are people there who have worked for him for 20 years. Amanda has put her entire career into it. They needed something that could get buyers interested again. And because I was doing well, you decided mine was available. That is not what I said." "It is exactly what you are saying." She shook her head. "You had your studio. You had your clients. You had options. So did they. You don't understand what Amanda was dealing with." That sentence landed in a place much older than Togethertown. I said, "Then explain it." Mom looked exhausted. "Amanda needed a win. Your father had already started talking about whether she was ready to take on more responsibility. If Harthwell went badly, he might have pulled back from the succession plan. She was terrified. And that made my work hers? No. Then what did it make it?" Mom rubbed both hands over her face. "Something you could survive losing." I stared at her. She seemed to hear herself only after the words were out. I asked quietly, "Why is that always enough for you?" Her eyes filled, but I did not rescue her from the question.
About to fold.
Sarah, no.
You just made an enemy of this
Why does
family.
Amanda needing
2
something
weeks
always
later,
have
my
to give
father
something up?
emailed me a single
Why does
paragraph
Dad being under pressure
informing
mean
me
my
I
boundaries
was no
become
longer
optional?
welcome at
Why does the
family
fact that I can
gatherings
take
until
care
I
of myself
apologized
turn
for
into
the
permission
scene
to
at the
take from me?
hospital?
Mom
I
looked
did
down at
not
the table.
apologize.
When she finally spoke,
I started
her
no
voice was
contact on a
barely above
Tuesday
whisper.
in early September
Amanda
of
needed us.
2023.
You never did.
What I did
For a
not
moment,
know,
I could not answer.
what nobody
Not
told
because
me
I
until
agreed,
2.5 years
because I
later,
suddenly understood
was
how
that
many years
2
of family
weeks
logic
after
fit inside those 6 words. I had spent my adult life becoming independent, partly because I could not rely on them. I had built my own career, financed my own business, handled my own problems, raised my daughter, and learned not to expect anyone to step in for me. Mom had watched all of that and somehow turned it into evidence that I deserved less protection, not more. You have it backward, I said. I stopped needing you because every time I did, you chose whoever looked more helpless. That is not fair.
On a hospital sketchpad. My ID badge was crooked. It showed me sitting in a chair. I had pulled my phone out, only holding my hand. On the subject line was my mother's voice, typed in lawyer shaky handwriting. 5 words. Final terms for the return of mom's belongings. Lily, please read in full before responding. I said. I set the cup down before I read the first line. I knew the cadence of her language, even in print. She started crying. She had been a Sunday school teacher at First Baptist Greer for 22 years.
Stomach tightened. To do what? Explore the concept. Explore mine. Sarah, please. I kept my voice level. Did they build a sample? She went still. That was the first moment all afternoon when I saw real panic. I had not known the answer before I asked. I had only followed the logic. Mom stood and walked to the counter, as if changing position could end the conversation. I don't know the technical side, but you know whether they built something. I know Kenneth was frustrated. With what? She did not answer. I stood too. Mom. She turned around. Your father only needed the working one because the company sample wouldn't stay together. The room seemed to narrow. I repeated her words carefully. The working one. Her face changed immediately. She knew what she had just admitted. I thought about Dad checking the connector with his thumb at Christmas, Mom asking repeatedly whether I was bringing Zoe's present, Wyatt already knowing the name, Dad taking the prototype from Zoe and insisting it stay with Wyatt overnight. They had not only seen the concept, they had tried to build it, and whatever they had built did not work. I picked up the paper from the table. Mom said, Sarah, don't make this worse. I looked at her. I'm not making anything worse, I'm finding out what you already did. She followed me to the front hall. Your father is scared. He will never say that, but he is. The company means everything to him. Then he should have protected it better. That sounds cruel. No. Cruel was taking a Christmas gift from a 9-year-old because he thought she was easier to hurt than I was. Mom closed her eyes. I opened the door. Before I left, she said, Please think about the people who work there. I turned back. I am. Then I drove away. I called Evelyn before I reached the end of my parents' street. They built their own. Evelyn was silent for a beat. Did she say when? No. Did she say who built it? No. But she specifically said Kenneth needed your working prototype because theirs would not stay together? Yes. Write down the conversation while it is fresh. Exact words where you can remember them. Do not contact Nolan product staff yourself. I wasn't planning to. Good. If their board is already worried about the Hearthwell hold, this gives us another reason to ask how far management took development before they had any license or assignment. I glanced at the concept sheet on the passenger seat. For weeks, I had been asking who took my work. Now I had a different question. How much had they already built with it before Christmas? The special committee was formed in the second week of January. I did not ask for it, and I could not have forced it if I wanted to. Hearthwell had its own reason to care. They were still willing to consider the product, but they were not going to put their name behind a launch, while Nolan Playworks could not clearly explain where Togethertown had come from or why my father was claiming rights he had never received from me. 2 of Nolan's outside investor directors and the independent director created the committee and hired separate counsel to review the internal records. For the first time since Christmas, the most important people looking at my father's decisions were not relatives and were not on his payroll. That mattered more than I expected. Dad had spent most of his career controlling the room. At family dinners, he decided what counted as an overreaction. At Nolan Playworks, he decided which risk was acceptable and which disagreement was disloyal. He had always been strongest when he could define the problem before anyone else got to speak. The committee took that away from him. They did not care whether I had embarrassed him. They cared about dates, ownership representations, internal approvals, and why a product scheduled for a national retailer presentation had no clean license or assignment behind it. The review took weeks, not days. That was probably healthier for me than an instant answer would have been. I still had a studio to run, clients to serve, and a daughter whose life could not become an extension of a corporate dispute. Zoe went back to school after the holiday break. Togethertown stayed at home, not in my office, because after Christmas, I wanted one thing to remain what I had intended it to be: her gift. By late January, Evelyn received the first selected findings from the committee's outside counsel under the confidentiality agreement. I was not given free access to Nolan Playworks' inboxes or internal servers. I saw only the records the committee considered relevant to the ownership dispute and the retailer review. That limitation frustrated me, but it also made the evidence harder for Dad to dismiss as something I had cherry-picked. The first document was an internal test summary for Nolan's own sample. I read it twice. Their development team had built a version based on the visual material they had received and their own assumptions about the connector geometry.
At the wedding, my mom texted me,
Also, they
smug
made
as
her
ever,
sign something.
no
The
punctuation,
house deed.
just her signature,
Joint
dashed
tenancy
like a
with
slap in the
Aunt Patty and
face,
Uncle
wrapped in formal tone.
She told
I
me
didn't
she didn't
reply.
read it.
I
She
logged
just
into my
found
account,
She
transferred the
just signed.
$6,500 honeymoon fund back to myself,
behave like a
and
daughter.
canceled the business
My
class
mother
flights I
had
booked
taken
under her
notes.
name.
What my mother
No
did not
shouting,
know
no
was that
drama,
the woman whose
just a
signature
quiet
she had
little
just
click.
collected
By
had
morning, I
already
had 23
11
missed
months
calls,
earlier, sat
but
in
only one
downtown
message.
Not because their sample had failed. I did not enjoy thinking about engineers trying to solve a problem with incomplete information. Most of them probably had no idea where the concept had originated. What relieved me was the confirmation that my mother had not accidentally handed over enough to reproduce my work. Dad had needed more. He had needed mine. The next document explained Christmas. It was a calendar entry created by Amanda's marketing team for the morning of December 23rd. Wyatt Final Togethertown Prototype Photography. The appointment was at a local studio at 8 in the morning. Harthwell's buyer presentation was scheduled later that morning by secure video from Nolan Playworks headquarters. There was no impossible race across the state, no coincidence. They planned to photograph the working set first, then use those images and the prototype in the presentation. I stared at the word final, not sample, not concept, Final Togethertown Prototype. They had expected to possess it. That meant my father had not decided on impulse to take Zoe's gift and keep it overnight. The cruelty of what he said might have been spontaneous, but the need for the object was not. I thought back to Mom asking repeatedly whether I was bringing the special town. I thought about Dad checking the connector with his thumb. I thought about how little surprise Amanda had shown when the wrapping came off. They had known what was arriving before I walked through the door. The next piece of evidence hurt in a different way.
Yes. Brenda
It was
put the
an email
stamp back
Amanda
in her
had sent
bag.
Dad in early November.
She walked out of the room
Sarah is
without
going to
saying a word.
recognize this.
My
Nothing
mother's
dramatic.
face turned the color
Nothing
of
that
cooked
said,
beets.
We
She
stole
stood
her
up,
design.
smoothed
Just
her
one
cardigan,
sentence.
picked up the
But it
folder,
destroyed
and
the
motioned
story
me
Amanda
into the
had been
hallway
telling
with 2
herself.
fingers.
Dad's
In the
response
hallway,
came
she did
11
not
minutes
raise her
later.
voice.
Then don't
My
show
mother
her the
never
campaign
raised her voice
until
in
after the
public.
buyer commits.
She leaned
I
in
sat
close
very
enough that
still.
I could smell her
Amanda
morning
had known.
coffee.
Maybe she had not
You don't
known at the
understand what
beginning.
we're trying to protect her from.
Maybe Dad really had told her
From
they
what,
were
Mom?
adapting
Bed
some
at night.
old
That
Nolan
overly
concept.
formal
did it
tone
because
she
she was a
used
good
when she
daughter.
wanted to sound
She did it
above
on
the
an
chaos
iPad
she
signed
often
into an
created,
Apple ID that
as though she
uploaded
were a
every
school
minute of
principal
footage
handing
to
down a
family
suspension,
iCloud drive
rather
she
than a
had never
mother
logged
cutting
into
out
in
her
her
own
life.
son from a family
She had hung a
milestone.
camera in
The
the
room
room,
felt unusually
and then she
quiet,
had pointed it
as if
at
the air
herself.
itself had paused to
Cassandra
see what he
texted
would
me
do
on a
next.
Wednesday.
But
She
Ethan
was
didn't
wearing a
move.
camel trench
He
coat.
didn't pace. He didn't write a furious email or
Want to
call
lose weight
anyone.
without losing muscle?
Instead,
Factor
he
got me
opened
there.
a blank
I
document
was
on
tired
his
of all the
laptop
cutting and bulking
and typed,
cycles.
Every email she had ever sent all this time the same way. I thought you had
Lily,
Your
I
father
stayed
on
I
the phone
not
prayed
to
about
her
this
for
45
just
minutes.
because I hated what
We're
it was.
prepared to give back what your grandmother left for you. I told her about the Yale
committee,
committee, after you come
about
to Juliet's
Juliet's
essay,
essay,
face us in person,
about the letter
Marlowe
Marlowe
apologized
had
on
several
video.
internal
3 months.
discussions
She
in which
listened
Dad
without
had
That was how
speaking.
long my grandmother had been
At
in the
the
ground.
end,
She
repeatedly
said,
argued
I
that
scrolled. What do you need me to do?
understood how
41
important
bullets. I told her I would call her back. I read them once the way
There
you
was
read a
something
lab
I had to
report
do
for a
first.
patient
I
you
would
don't
on
know
the
yet.
evening
Evening of March says,
That phrase
drug-free
sounded exactly
workplace,
like
random
it was not a
testing
perfect
in
smoking
effect.
gun.
I
It
had
was
passed
worse
my
in some
December
ways
screen
because it
3
showed a
weeks
pattern.
earlier. I called
Dad
my
had
old
not
church
planned on
friend
beating
Bethany
me
on
in court before
speakerphone
Christmas.
and asked
He
her
had planned on
gently
beating me with guilt.
what people were
He
saying.
thought if the product was
She
far enough
paused for a
along,
long time.
if the buyer was
She
interested
said,
enough, if
Patty
42
says you've been
employees were
struggling with
depending on the
substances
lodge,
and toxic
I would decide
influences.
ownership was less important
She says
than
they've
everyone
had to
else's
set hard
livelihood.
boundaries to
The plan
protect
only
Mama.
worked if I behaved the way my family had
Substances
trained themselves
and
to
toxic
expect.
influence.
Sarah can take it. Sarah will understand. Sarah will give something up because she has more options. For the first time, I saw the whole structure. Mom had given Dad the concept because I was doing fine. Amanda had kept going because she needed a win. Dad had expected me to surrender because the employees would need protecting. Every person involved had found a different reason why my loss was acceptable. I was still processing that when the pressure moved outside the company. Dad did not launch a public campaign against me. He was too smart for that. What he did was quieter. A former family friend called and asked whether I really wanted to tear apart everything your father built. One of Nolan's senior managers sent a short message saying everyone was worried about the Hearthwell. Hold. Then a man named Marcus, who had worked with me years earlier in product development, called my studio. I almost did not answer. Marcus did not accuse me of anything. I'm not calling for Kenneth, he said. Okay. I just need to know if there is a version of this where the product survives. That stopped me. What has he told people? That the dispute could cost us Hearthwell. That isn't what I asked. Marcus sighed. People are scared, Sarah. I looked through the glass wall at my own team. How bad? We are not shutting down tomorrow. But everyone knows the last 2 years were not great. If this launch disappears before the lender review, it gets harder. There it was. The version of pressure Dad understood best because it was partly true. People who had nothing to do with what he had done could be affected. Marcus did not ask me to hand over the product. He just said, if there is a way to protect what is yours without taking the rest of us down with him, I hope you find it. After we hung up, I sat with that for a long time. I was angry with my father. I was furious with my mother. I did not know yet whether I would ever trust Amanda again. But none of those feelings made the people assembling toys in Nolan's warehouse responsible for what management had done. That evening, another email arrived from Evelyn. Nolan Playworks had made a settlement offer. I opened the summary and read the number twice. It was enough to pay off the remaining equipment line at my studio, cover the legal expenses I had already incurred, and leave a cushion large enough that Zoe and I could breathe easier for years. Then I read the rest. Nolan Playworks would keep the commercial rights to Together Town. I would sign a confidentiality agreement. They would not be required to identify me publicly as the creator. The campaign could continue under the Nolan story they had already been building. In return, the dispute would end. I stared at the screen. For the first time since Christmas, my father was offering to give me something instead of take it. All I had to give him back was the truth. The settlement sat open on my laptop for almost an hour before I touched anything else. I had expected Dad to threaten me again. Maybe send another letter telling me I was damaging Nolan Playworks. I had not expected him to offer enough money to make the argument uncomfortable. The number would have paid off the remaining equipment line at my studio, covered every legal bill I had accumulated since Christmas, and left enough cash in reserve that I could stop calculating how many months of litigation I could survive if the dispute turned into a lawsuit. I was not rich enough to pretend that did not matter. I had employees, rent, insurance, taxes, and a 9-year-old daughter whose future mattered more to me than proving I could win every fight on principle. Evelyn went through the terms with me the next morning. Nolan wanted broad commercialization rights to Together Town, a mutual release, confidentiality, and language preventing either side from publicly accusing the other of wrongdoing. They would not be required to identify me as the creator. They could keep using the campaign structure they had already developed, provided they avoided making specific legal claims about inventorship that could create new problems. In practical terms, Dad was offering to buy the dispute before anyone outside the retailer, the lawyers, and the board understood exactly how the product had reached Nolan Playworks. What do you think? I asked. Evelyn did not answer immediately. I think it is enough money that you should consider it seriously. That is not the same as saying I should take it. No, it is me refusing to make a personal decision for you. I appreciated that. She had been careful from the beginning not to turn this into a morality play. A settlement was not surrender simply because the other side had behaved badly. Businesses settled disputes every day because certainty had value. If I accepted, I could protect my studio, stop spending money on lawyers, and close the door on a fight that could drag through the year. I spent the afternoon doing what I always did when emotion made a decision harder. I built a spreadsheet. I listed the equipment line, expected legal spend if the dispute continued, projected studio revenue, current cash reserves, the cost of replacing one machine within the next 18 months, and the savings I was already setting aside for Zoe. The settlement solved real problems. It did not create imaginary wealth, but it would have made my business safer overnight. For about 20 minutes, I could imagine taking it. Then I opened the section dealing with rights. That was where the number stopped looking generous. Under Nolan's proposal, Togethertown would become a Nolan product in every way that mattered commercially. My name did not have to disappear, but there was no obligation to place it anywhere. Dad could still stand in front of buyers and talk about the next generation of Nolan innovation. Amanda could still market the line as part of the family company's revival. Wyatt could remain connected to the campaign. The truth would not technically be denied. It would simply become optional. I closed the document and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring. "I'm not asking you to take sides," I said. "I need to understand how bad things actually are." He exhaled. "Depends what you mean by bad. Is Nolan about to miss payroll?" "No." "Are people getting laid off next week?" "No." "Is the company insolvent?" "Not that I know." I waited. Marcus finally said, "The Hearthwell opportunity matters. The lender review matters. If both go badly, there will probably be cuts later."
A
But
part
Kenneth
written
has
by my
been
mother.
talking like you pulled the fire
I would have to
alarm in a
find that
burning
one
building.
myself.
It
The
is
honor
not that
committee
simple.
process began on
That
March
was what
4th.
I needed to know.
I
The
drafted a
pressure
formal
was
request
real.
and sent it
The
to Marlo.
catastrophe Dad kept
I
implying
asked
was
the
not.
committee to compare my
asked,
submitted personal statement from the
Hearthwell still got the
2025
product under
cycle
a
with
legitimate
Juliet's
license,
submitted
would
personal
that help?
statement from the
Marcus went
2024
quiet.
cycle,
Yes.
specifically
Even
the
if Nolan didn't
paragraphs
want it outright,
referencing a
if the
pediatric
economics
oncology
worked.
patient.
I thanked him and
I
ended
attached
the
my
call.
original
For
draft
the first
document
time
from
since I
spring
received the
2020.
settlement, I could see the shape of the trick. Dad wanted me to believe there were only two choices. Either I surrendered Togethertown, or I became responsible for whatever happened to 42 employees. That was the same logic my family had used on me for years. Amanda needed more. Dad was under pressure. Mom was scared. The company mattered. Sarah could handle it. The person expected to absorb the loss was always chosen before anyone asked whether the loss was necessary. That evening, I printed the settlement and brought it home. Zoe was at the kitchen counter doing homework while I made dinner. I left the papers farther down the counter, face down, but she had been watching me carry versions of the same documents in and out of the house for weeks. "Is that Grandpa stuff?" she asked. "Business stuff." "With Grandpa?" "Yes." She went back to writing for a minute. Then she asked, "Are you done fighting?" I looked at her. "I'm trying to decide what the right ending is." She frowned. "What happens if you say yes?" I should probably have given her a simpler answer, but I had already learned that Zoe noticed when adults hid the center of a question. They would pay me money, and Nolan Playworks would keep using Togethertown. "Would it still be yours?" "That depends what you mean by mine." She thought about that. "Would Grandpa get to say he made it?" I looked at the papers. "Something like that." Zoe's pencil stopped. "But he didn't." Then she went back to her homework. She did not ask me to fight. She did not tell me what to do. She had no idea what the settlement number meant or what litigation could cost. But she had cut through every paragraph in the agreement more cleanly than most adults around me had managed. The problem was not whether Dad deserved to lose. The problem was whether I was willing to sell him the right to keep lying. That night, after Zoe went to bed, I opened a blank document. I did not start with revenge. I started with what everyone actually needed. Hearthwell needed a product it could sell without rights uncertainty. Nolan Playworks needed manufacturing volume and a credible launch. The employees needed the company to stay stable. My studio needed compensation, control over the work, and protection from having the same thing happen again. I needed Dad to stop treating my ownership as a negotiable inconvenience. So I built a third option. My studio would retain the rights tied to the connector design and the development materials I had created. Nolan Playworks could receive a manufacturing license rather than ownership. They would pay royalties. I would retain approval over quality standards because a bad version of the connector could damage both the product and my reputation. The origin story had to be accurate. No language suggesting Wyatt invented Togethertown. No claim that the product emerged from Nolan's internal development team. Zoe would not be used in campaign material without my explicit consent. And neither child would be turned into a fake inventor to sell a family narrative. Most importantly, The agreement would let Harthwell continue reviewing the product. The jobs Dad had been holding up in front of me did not have to disappear. Neither did my rights. I sent the draft to Evelyn the next morning. She called 10 minutes later. "You wrote this yourself?" "I wrote the business structure. You can make it legally usable." I was about to say there are places I need to tighten. I assumed there would be. She paused. "This is more expensive for Nolan than owning it." "Yes. But cheaper than losing the product entirely." "Yes. And it removes the argument that you're trying to kill the Harthwell deal." "That is the point." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Then I think we have something." I told her to reject the settlement. Not angrily. Not with a speech. Just no. We sent the licensing counter-proposal to Nolan's special committee and to Harthwell's legal team under the existing confidentiality arrangement. Dad called me twice that afternoon. I did not answer. Mom texted asking why I was making this harder than it had to be. Amanda sent nothing. For 3 days, I heard almost nothing. Then Harthwell responded. They were willing to continue commercial review under a clean licensing structure. I read that line twice and felt my shoulders loosen for the first time in weeks. Then I read the next paragraph. Harthwell had one additional condition. They would not move forward while the same management team that had created the ownership problem still controlled the company's product rights representations. I sat back in my chair. Until that moment, Dad had kept insisting the only thing standing between Nolan Playworks and survival was me. Now the retailer had made something else clear. The product was not the problem anymore. Management was. By late February, the dispute had stopped feeling like something happening to me and started feeling like a test of whether Nolan Playworks could still function without my father controlling every answer. The special committee scheduled a joint meeting with the 5-member board, outside counsel, Nolan's general counsel, Harthwell's legal and business representatives, Evelyn, and me. Harthwell joined by secure video. I sat at one end of the conference table with a folder in front of me and reminded myself that I was not there to win an argument with my father. I was there to make sure nobody could pretend the facts were still unclear. Dad spoke first. Of course he did. He talked about the history of Nolan Playworks, the 42 employees who depended on it, the difficult retail market, and the years I had spent learning inside the company. He called together town an adaptation dispute and said a family disagreement had been allowed to contaminate a legitimate business relationship. He never used the word stolen. He never mentioned Zoe. He spoke as if the problem had begun when I sent the notice instead of when he decided my work was available to him. When he finished, one of the investor directors asked whether I wanted to respond. I did not answer Dad point by point. That was the trap he wanted. If I argued about Christmas, he could call me emotional. If I defended my character, he could turn the meeting into a family trial. So I opened the licensing proposal Evelyn and I had refined and kept my voice level. Harthwell can still get the product, I said. Nolan can still manufacture it. The employees can still have the work. My studio retains the rights we developed, Nolan pays for the license, and the product goes forward under an accurate ownership structure. Nobody here has to lose their job because of me. The only thing that has to go is the lie. Dad leaned back in his chair. You are asking my company to pay you for work that grew out of Nolan methods. That is your legal position, I said. It is not the same thing as proof. The independent director raised a hand before Dad could answer. Let counsel walk through the chronology. That was the moment the room stopped belonging to him. The special committee's outside counsel began with dates, not accusations. My CAD files and testing logs showed development beginning in January of 2025. My supplier invoices matched those dates. My provisional filing for the connector mechanism had been made in May. Beverly received presentation sheets in June. Nolan's own internal development records began later. None of those facts alone proved every question of ownership, but together they established a sequence that was very different from the one Dad had been describing. Then counsel displayed the scanned concept sheet. Mom shifted in her chair. Her handwritten note was visible in the corner. Ken's second version is stronger. Counsel did not dramatize it. She simply stated that Beverly had acknowledged giving those sheets to Kenneth and that Nolan Playworks had no executed assignment or license from me covering the work that followed. Dad said, presentation material is not an invention. No one said it was, counsel replied. The issue is what management did after receiving it. The next document was Nolan's failed sample report. I watched Amanda stop taking notes. The report described connector failures, inconsistent fit, and a model that separated under normal handling. Then came the calendar entry for December 23rd, Wyatt final Togethertown prototype photography. One of the Hearthwell representatives leaned closer to his camera. So the company had scheduled photography of a final prototype it did not actually have yet? Dad said. We expected to resolve the family issue. The independent director looked at him. Before 8 the next morning? Dad did not answer. Then counsel read Amanda's email. Sarah is going to recognize this. Amanda's face went pale. She tried to recover quickly. I was told the concept was based on old Nolan development. Counsel nodded once. And after you developed that concern, did you stop the campaign? Amanda looked at Dad. Counsel moved to his reply. Then don't show her the campaign until after the buyer commits. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. Amanda said, Dad was making the final decisions. The Hearthwell lawyer answered before I could. That may explain authority. It does not explain your knowledge. Amanda looked down. For most of my life, she had been protected by being the daughter Dad chose. That email was the first thing I had seen that protection fail against. He could not absorb responsibility for a sentence she had written herself. Mom spoke next. Sarah, this has gone far enough. I turned toward her. She looked close to tears. Your father built this company for both of you. Whatever mistakes were made, humiliating him in front of investors is not going to fix our family. I asked the only question that mattered. Then why did all three of you have to hide what you were doing from me? Mom opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Dad stepped in. This company took a risk because we believed the product belonged inside the Nolan business. Sarah is using technicalities to punish us for that judgment. A Hearthwell executive finally spoke. We are not evaluating your family judgment, Mr. Nolan. We are evaluating whether we can rely on your company's rights representations. Dad's expression tightened. The executive continued. We remain interested in the product under the licensing structure Sarah proposed, assuming the rights documentation is completed. Our concern is management credibility. That changed the air in the room. Dad had spent weeks telling everyone I was the obstacle between Nolan Playworks and Hearthwell. Now Hearthwell had just said the product could move forward. With me. What they did not want was him controlling the representations around it. One of the investor directors asked for a short recess. The independent director said the board would move into executive session to consider officer actions and governance controls. Hearthwell disconnected. Evelyn and I gathered our papers. Beverly was asked to wait outside as well because her role as corporate secretary was under review. Dad followed me into the hallway. For the first time since Christmas, he looked tired rather than angry. You finally got what you wanted, he said. I looked at him. No, I got back what was mine. His jaw tightened. I added nothing else. The boardroom door closed behind him a minute later. I was not inside when they voted. That mattered to me. Whatever happened next would not be something I did to my father from a chair across the table. It would be the consequence of what he had already done. The board took a little over an hour. Evelyn and I waited in a smaller conference room down the hall, while Beverly sat alone near the elevators. Amanda had disappeared somewhere with Nolan's general counsel. I did not try to find her. By then, there was nothing left I needed to hear from my sister, that the emails had not already answered more clearly. When the independent director finally came for me, his expression gave nothing away. He asked Evelyn and me to return to the boardroom, but Kenneth was already there, sitting rigidly at the far end of the table with both hands flat in front of him. The decision was not dramatic in the way people imagine corporate consequences. Nobody slammed a gavel. Nobody escorted Dad from the building. The independent director simply read the resolutions the board had approved. Effective immediately, Kenneth was removed as chief executive officer. He would no longer serve as board chair, and the independent director would take that position while the company worked through the Hearthwell issue and the broader governance review. Dad still owned his shares. He still held his director seat. No one could legally erase 30 years of ownership with a single vote, and the board did not pretend otherwise. What they took from him was the thing he had used more aggressively than money: operational control. Dad did not look at the directors. He looked at me. I did not smile. Amanda's consequences came next. She was removed from her position as marketing vice president because the committee had concluded that she continued preparing a campaign after she understood there was a serious question about where the product came from. Her planned succession into senior leadership was suspended indefinitely. Whether she remained connected to Nolan Playworks in any capacity would be handled separately, but the future Dad had been building for her was gone before the meeting ended. Amanda tried once more to say she had acted under his direction. One investor director answered that reporting to a chief executive did not eliminate her own professional obligations. She stopped talking after that. Beverly was removed as corporate secretary. Her role had never given her the same power Dad or Amanda held, but it had given her access, legitimacy, and the comforting belief that she did
At
not
the
need
time,
to do family
it had seemed like a
business,
small
actual
favor.
business.
Use
One
the
of
family
many.
Apple ID.
He clicked
The board's
The old
cancel.
one Aunt Marianne
The page
set up in
processed for a
2015.
moment
It addressed what
before
she remembered
confirming the
the password
refund,
who transferred
$3,800,
10
deposited back to his
Already on
account
it.
within 5
That
to 7
family
business
Apple
days.
ID had been on
He
Aunt
moved on to his
Marianne's phone
banking app,
before she died.
found the transfer
It had
record
been
from
on
3
Walter's.
weeks prior,
It had been on
$6,500 wired
It
to
had been
Marilyn's
on
account,
The
marked
word
My
as
mother had never
wedding
used
gift
it because
honeymoon
my mother
support.
believed iCloud
He
was a
reversed
place
it.
for criminals.
No, you risked the Nolan name over something you could have asked me to license. His mouth tightened. You think they are going to respect you because you forced your own father out? This was never yours to give away. That finally made him stand. I built the company that taught you how to make it, and I spent 6 years proving I could build without it. For a moment, I saw the version of my father I had spent most of my life trying to impress, the founder. The man who could walk through a factory and spot a packaging problem from 20 feet away. The businessman whose approval had once felt like proof I was good at what I did. Then I saw the rest of him too. The man who had confused teaching me with owning me. I left. The board vote did not solve everything that afternoon. That was important. Harthwell still needed clean documentation. Our lawyers still had to turn my licensing proposal into an actual agreement. Nolan Playworks still had to prove it could manufacture the connector within tolerance without quietly changing the design into something unreliable. There were royalty calculations, quality control provisions, approval rights, insurance language, and enough drafts to make me regret ever learning how contracts worked. It took several more weeks. By March, we had an agreement. My studio retained the rights connected to the Togethertown connector and the development materials I had created. Nolan Playworks received a manufacturing license. They would pay royalties tied to sales. I retained defined quality control approval over the mechanism, and the product could not be marketed as an invention created by Wyatt or as something developed entirely inside Nolan Playworks. My name appeared where it belonged. Zoe's name did not become part of the advertising because I never wanted her childhood turned into compensation for what my family had done. Harthwell resumed its review after the agreement was signed. The employees kept their work. That mattered to me. So did the fact that saving their jobs did not require saving Dad from the consequences of his decisions. Amanda barely contacted me after the board meeting. The one message she sent said she hoped I was happy. I typed 3 different responses and deleted all of them. Eventually, I wrote nothing. She still seemed to believe my victory and her loss were the same event. Maybe one day she would understand that her job disappeared because she had made a professional choice long before I ever entered that boardroom. Beverly tried harder. At first, she called almost every day. Then she started sending long messages about family, forgiveness, and how badly Dad was taking everything. I answered once, in writing, because I wanted no misunderstanding. She was not welcome to drop by my studio. She was not to use Zoe's photograph, name, or relationship to the family in anything connected to Nolan Playworks. If she wanted to see Zoe, she would ask me first. Being her grandmother did not give her automatic access after she had stood in a room and allowed Kenneth to tell my daughter she was not real family. Mom replied that I was punishing her. I told her boundaries were not punishment. After that, the messages became shorter. Kenneth did not apologize. For a while, I thought that would bother me more than it did. What changed was not that I stopped caring what my father believed. It was that I stopped treating his approval as something I needed before I could trust my own judgment. Wyatt remained outside the conflict as much as I could manage. A few weeks after everything settled, Amanda brought him to one family gathering I attended briefly because Zoe had asked to see him. The adults were awkward. The kids were not. At one point, Wyatt looked at the Together Town prototype on the table and said quietly to Zoe, "Grandpa told me it was mine." Zuschrechet. I know. There was no accusation in her voice. She handed him one of the buildings. "Want to make the bridge longer?" He nodded, and the two of them sat on the floor connecting pieces while the adults avoided looking directly at one another. That was when I understood something I had been too angry to see at Christmas. Kenneth had tried to turn blood into a hierarchy. The children had never needed one. It is spring now, as I tell this. A production sample of Together Town sits on my studio table beside Zoe's original prototype. The new version is cleaner. The wood finish is better. The tolerances are tighter. Manufacturing always changes things a little, but the connector is still mine. Under the original base, Zoe's pencil marks are still there. Z plus mum. A few days ago, she placed the old prototype beside the new production sample and connected one of the original houses to the newer set. It clicked into place perfectly. I spent years believing strength meant being the person who could take more without breaking. I know better now. Sometimes strength is refusing to let the people who love your resilience treat it like something they are entitled to spend. You should
During their
never let your
courtship,
strength
you watched her
determine
die
the
from a
success
perilous
of
spring
others
of
who needed more from you.
1957. That, before
Is
they
not
married in
this does not mean you owe your
1958, that is a
family,
decision
there
you
was the
made over
sapphire
months.
engagement
Your
ring
she
he had
said,
bought her in
"You
Charleston.
don't have to do this tomorrow." There was
Someone
the
crosses
Purple
a
Heart he had
boundary,
earned
don't
outside
mean
White
yes.
City in
Protect what
1968
belongs to you.
and
She
never
has to make
spoken of
decisions
once.
based
I
on
saved the
facts.
call with my family
records.
Bible from
You can
19
keep
at
her
11:18.
with the
My
names
mother
of
left
great
great-great-grandparents
without
written
accepting
4
the
minutes copper plate
possibility
12
of another
seconds.
person's
Elizabeth,
bad
there was a
choices.
recipe book she had been
You
keeping
also
since
do
she
not
got
have to
married.
destroy everyone around a wrongdoer to hold that person accountable. Sometimes, the smartest response is to separate the innocent from the people who actually made the harmful decisions, then make sure the consequences reach the right people. If relatives repeatedly tell you that you should sacrifice because you are strong enough to handle it, remember that your resilience is not a family resource they are entitled to spend. Protecting your child is especially important. A child should never have to earn a place in a family based on blood, favoritism, money, or usefulness. When adults deliberately make a child feel unwanted, you have every right to reduce their access until they can behave with respect. Forgiveness, if you choose it, does not require restoring the same level of trust. Boundaries can remain even after anger fades. Most importantly, you should not confuse peace with surrender. Real peace comes when you can walk away knowing you acted fairly, protected what mattered, and refused to reward dishonesty. If stories like this help you recognize unhealthy family patterns and make stronger choices, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story.